So this is the first of our snippets for this week, which is going to be focusing on the early stages of the Johnson administration. Johnson, of course, takes office after the assassination of President Kennedy. These are photographs of him with Defense Secretary McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, National Security Advisor Bundy, people that we've already sort of encountered last week. What's different here is that Kennedy really was kind of a foreign policy president, and so he welcomed ideas from these senior people, but he was sort of probing. Johnson is much more interested in domestic affairs than he is in foreign policy, and so Kennedy, the Kennedy team, which I think worked really well for Kennedy, doesn't work well for Johnson. And in retrospect, really, Johnson should have just demanded everyone's resignation upon becoming president, but he didn't want to do that after the assassination. He wanted to present continuity. So, to me, the biggest shift from Kennedy to Johnson is this change from a president who was more interested in foreign policy than domestic policy to a president who really saw foreign policy activism as a distraction to his domestic agenda, and who also tended to have a very political view, that is, concerned about the domestic political effects of foreign policy decisions, which would prove to be disastrous as a result of Vietnam. We know a lot about how Johnson approached things, especially early in his administration, because he was a relentless taper, and he preferred to deal with people on the telephone because he sort of wanted a record of what he was a dealer. So he wanted a record of what he had promised other people, but more important, what other key legislators were promising him. His first foreign policy issue was, of all things, foreign aid appropriations, which was a notoriously difficult thing to get through in the Kennedy and Eisenhower years, partially because foreign aid was then, as well as now, extremely unpopular, partially because of this man, Otto Passman, who represented a district from northeastern Louisiana and he was a very, very conservative Democrat who was obsessed with the idea of foreign aid. He wanted to cut foreign aid. His argument was that it was just sort of aid to socialist countries around the world. And Passman's definition of what was and wasn't a socialist country, it was like anything to the left of Francisco Franco's government in Spain was sort of unacceptably socialist to Passman. So Johnson had a difficult time with Passman on this bill, which came up around a month after he took office. Passman wanted to slash a proposal. And he also had difficulty with a proposal offered by Republicans, again, this intersection between domestic politics and foreign policy. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. had started subsidizing Soviet wheat because the Soviet Union was having wheat shortages, and there was a fear if the U.S. didn't do this. Remember, we talked about the disarmament package with Kennedy, fear that if they didn't do this, Khrushchev would fall from power. Ultimately fell from power in 1964 anyway. But the Republicans knew this. They're gearing up for an election against Johnson. And so they propose an amendment to the foreign aid bill that would allow Johnson to continue to send wheat to the Soviet Union, continue to spend economic and military assistance to Yugoslavia, the communist country that was sort of neutral in the Cold War. But each time Johnson did it, he would be required to make a public report to Congress saying that this decision was in the national interest. And Johnson, I think, understood that could be politically dicey. So after the passage of this amendment, which managed to get through the House because 5 very, very conservative Texas Democrats, this is a time when the South is one-party Democratic, defected. They told Johnson they were going to vote with him, and they changed their mind right at the end. Johnson gets on the phone with this man, Albert Thomas, who was an old friend of his, congressman from the Houston, Texas area, to sort of review what had happened in this debate. And what you see here are two people who sort of understood how politics operated. And as you listen to this conversation, try to picture John Kennedy engaged in this kind of conversation. It just wouldn't be possible. So it's a good illustration of how the two presidents so significantly differed. So this is from December of 1963.
I don't want to debate with you, my friend. I love you, but you know goddamn well when I asked them not to make me notify them publicly so it wouldn't be in the papers.
Well,
You know, I know what I'm doing, and
Frankly,
you know, and we screwed it up. This damn fool Humphrey put that paragraph on. I told Albert to get it off, cut it off.
I think it's your partners over on the Senate side, and the old Otto played ball. He told me he's going to do his damnedest to take it out. Have you got the language in front of you?
Yes, sir. I got it in front of me. And it oughtn't to be in there, and it's just a damn...
Agency on national in connection with the purchase in...
That's right, and...
National, except when the President determines that such guarantees would be in the national...
That's all right, period.
And reports each...
No, period. That's the national interest.
But read your language further. Reports each determination.
Why should I want to report to everybody that I screwed a girl? You screwed one last night, but you don't want to report it.
I wish I did.
Well, you know what I'm talking about. That made it come home to you, didn't it?
Well, it ain't gonna.
Well, don't you think I'm a damned idiot now?
No, of course not. But I don't think it's gonna hamstring you a bit on her.
It doesn't hamstring me. It just publicizes that I'm pro-Russian right when Nixon's running against me. That's all it does.
Well, he ain't gonna run because he ain't gonna wait.
Well, listen, Albert. You and I are buddies now, and you understand politics, and I do too. And I'm telling you that we're working with the Republicans up there 100%.
Well, I'm on your side.
Well, all right. Well, you just don't ever agree that that's a good clause, because you know goddamn well it ain't. Don't try to shit me, because I know better.
Here's the speaker. Well, I've worked with it in the space.
Yeah, you work with it, but you've been working with it under Republican presidents, not under Democrat. When a Democratic president has to report that he makes a determination that it's in his interest to go with Russia, it's not good when you're running for office. Now, you know that, don't you?
And it's kind of blunt language, but there's nothing about the national interest or anything like this, and how Johnson is approaching foreign aid. It's all how is this going to affect me politically, and that's the backdrop to this really weird situation that Johnson faces in early 1964 in Vietnam. The military coup, which is Kennedy's sort of last major policy gambit as president, as Robert Kennedy predicted. Remember, we heard Kennedy's tape, Robert Kennedy's tape last week. Turns out disastrously, it leads to a weakened South Vietnamese government that everyone sort of senses is a puppet government of the U.S. And North Vietnamese assistance for the South Vietnamese communist forces, the Viet Minh, increase during the early 1964. The situation is deteriorating. The government of South Vietnam is unstable. The military regime that took over from Diem after the Kennedy coup is itself overthrown in March of 1964. So Johnson is facing this as a potential problem. But he's also facing one of the most remarkable political developments in terms of foreign policy that we'll cover in this entire course. Remember that Kennedy had installed as his ambassador to South Vietnam Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., former Republican senator, former Republican vice presidential candidate. And Kennedy basically had put Lodge there. Lodge then supports a coup. Put Lodge there because he wanted to figure if things go bad in Vietnam, having a prominent Republican would be a way for Kennedy to kind of deflect the partisan blame. The problem is now Johnson has this prominent Republican, and Lodge, in violation of this law called the Hatch Act, which says that federal employees of that rank aren't supposed to be engaged in partisan politics. Lodge basically decides that he kind of like to be president. And what he concludes is that if he can somehow get the Republican nomination as a write-in candidate, that is, he won't be on the ballot, he won't formally announce his bid, but he'll encourage his supporters. His son basically coordinates this effort to organize campaigns where you would write in his name. That would be a kind of dramatic event, and that he could then come back, accept the Republican nomination, and run against LBJ as a kind of citizen patriot, someone who is working for the common good. It's a very long shot campaign. But one of the interesting things here is that Lodge, who was quite moderate on domestic issues, is the only Republican candidate who actually runs close to Johnson in contemporary polling. So Johnson is afraid of him. And what Johnson realizes is that as Lodge is kind of pushing this idea, he suddenly wins as a write-in, wins the New Hampshire primary, the first in the nation primary in 1964. He surges to the lead in Republican polling. And he starts increasingly asking for more and more and more U.S. commitments, military aid, military involvement in South Vietnam, seemingly with the expectation Johnson would say no, and then with the hope that he could kind of use that to run against Johnson in the fall. So this kind of citizen patriot approach is absurd in this respect. Johnson understands what's going on, and here he is with Defense Secretary McNamara. And one of the things I think that you try to listen as you hear, I mean, he's talking about the new leader, Nguyen Khan, is the degree to which Johnson is basically deferring Vietnam policy to Lodge because he's worried that otherwise Lodge will use this against him in a prospective political campaign. This is from April of '64.
You think it's a mistake to explain what I'm saying now about Vietnam and what we're faced with?
Well, I do think, Mr. President, that it'd be wise for you to say as little as possible. The frank answer is we don't know what's going on out there. The signs I see coming through the cables are disturbing signs. Poor morale in Vietnamese forces, poor morale in the armed forces, disunity, tremendous amount of coup planning against Khan, about what you'd expect in a situation.
Well, then why don't we take some pretty offensive steps pretty quickly then? Why don't we commend Khan on his operation and try to prop him up? Why don't we raise the salary of the soldiers to improve that morale instead of waiting a long time? Why don't we do some of these things that incline to bolster them?
Well, I'm not sure that State here.
I sure as hell don't want to get in the position Lodge recommended to me. The one thing he recommended is please give us a little more pay for our soldiers, and we turned him down.
Oh no, we've done that.
We haven't acted. We said we're going to wait till you go out there.
Well, no, he knows that there's money for that. There's no problem on that issue.
Well, then why don't we clear it up so that we get him answered? Now, I think it politically. I'm not a military strategist, but I think as long as we've got him there and he makes recommendations and we act on them, particularly if we act favorably, we're not in too bad a condition politically. But I think when he wires us and says the only damn thing I want you to do is give him an increase in pay because the morale's terrible, and we say, well, wait, then if something happens in between, I think we are caught with our britches down.
This is really a remarkable conversation. There are two items that hopefully you sort of reflect on a little. The first is there are more than 20,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam by this point. But Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, says the frank answer is we don't know what's going on out there. One of the big themes of the Vietnam War under Johnson is this thing called the credibility gap. That is that the administration is saying one thing to the public and one thing privately, and that snippet's a good example of the credibility gap in action. And then the second is Johnson's statement down here at the bottom. I'm not a military strategist, but I think as long as we've got Lodge there and he makes recommendations and we act on them, particularly if we act favorably, we're not in too bad a condition politically. So Johnson's basically telling McNamara, we want to agree with whatever Lodge wants to do. And this is the pattern that occurs throughout Vietnam in the spring of 1964. Lodge makes demands. The Johnson administration accommodates them largely because they're afraid of Lodge. Lodge ultimately, as probably all of you know, does not get the Republican nomination in 1964. His strategy was basically built on the idea that he would consistently do well in these primaries, better than expected, and basically be able to go to the Republican leadership and say, look, I've demonstrated that we're popular, and you should nominate me as the party's only chance of winning. He stumbles in the next to last primary in Oregon, and then his candidacy largely fizzles. And as a result, the Republicans wind up going with a very conservative nominee, Barry Goldwater, a Republican senator from Arizona, who also criticizes Johnson's policy, but in Goldwater's case, more clearly from the right. Goldwater talks about the possibility of maybe using nuclear weaponry in in Vietnam, and wants a dramatic escalation of the war. So that's the political environment that Johnson faces as the fall campaign begins. And then he seems to catch a break, which is that the North Vietnamese attack a U.S. naval vessel. Here's Robert McNamara pointing it out in a public address, in a body of water called the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of North Vietnam. The Americans claimed this was an unprompted attack. That's not true. The U.S. vessels were assisting South Vietnamese vessels who were engaged in a covert raid on the North Vietnamese shores. But in any case, the attack occurs. The administration's response to this is to propose a resolution that will go to Congress known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which says that Congress agrees to approve any administration response to defend American interests in the aftermath of these attacks. Johnson orders a military bombing of a series of military raids on North Vietnam. But it's this conditional kind of blank check that Johnson will later use in 65 and 66 to say, oh, look, Congress authorized a broader approach to the war. This is Johnson announcing publicly that he had authorized this military raid. Again, the intersection between politics and policy. He delivers this speech a little after 11:30 p.m. Eastern time. He wants to catch the 11 p.m. news. This is of course pre-cable news. Wants to make sure people are seeing him before they go to bed. And it turns out that Johnson announces the raids before the U.S. planes had actually taken off. There were weather problems in the Tonkin Gulf. Doesn't make any difference. The retaliatory raid succeeds, but that's an issue. At the end of the day, the House unanimously approves the Tonkin Gulf resolution, although there is one member, this guy Ed Foreman, who was a Republican congressman from Texas, who criticizes Johnson, says that Johnson was shooting from the lip by announcing the raids before the raids had occurred. Johnson notices this and doesn't like it. And in the Senate, though, there are two members who vote against. Foreman ultimately still votes for the resolution. There are two members in the Senate who vote against the resolution. The man on the left here is Ernest Greening, who was a Democratic senator from Alaska. On the right, it's Wayne Morse, who was a Democratic senator from Oregon. Morse argues that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was a predated declaration of war and therefore unconstitutional. He says only Congress can declare war. Congress can't give its power to the president to wage war as he wants. The Greening critique is a more radical one. Greening basically makes an anti-imperialist argument. He says what we're doing here is morally wrong in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese regime is not worth the effort. The U.S. should not be participating in a military action that seems like it's colonialism, and they vote against. They're the only two. The vote in the Senate is 88-2. Johnson notices this, and despite this overwhelming support, focuses on the people who voted no or who criticized him. And one backdrop to this conversation, there had been a major earthquake in Alaska in the spring of 1964, and as a result, there's a lot of disaster aid that goes from the U.S. government to Alaska. And as we'll see, Johnson seems to believe that because the federal government gave aid to his home state, that kind of obligated Greening to go along with it. He's talking here with the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts.
That's a good vote you had today.
Yes, it was very good, 414-0, one present. What'd the Senate do?
88-2. Morse and Greening.
I don't understand Greening.
Oh, he's no good. He's worse than Morse. He's just no good. I've spent millions on him up in Alaska. He's just no good. And Morse is just undependable and erratic as he can be.
Radical. I don't understand the other part.
Say, I wanted to point out this little shit-ass foreman today got up and said that we acted impulsively and by announcing that we had an answer on the way before the planes dropped their bombs. It's just a pure lie and smokescreen.
He was booed 2 or 3 times. Tremendous booing on the Democratic side. He was. Everybody knew he was just cheap and mean and contemptible. Well, you know what he is.
Yeah, he's no good.
Again, this intersection between politics and the making of foreign policy, and that ends our first snippet for Johnson.